Welcome to Losing a Child, Always Andy's Mom. On this podcast, we journey through the devastating experience of the death of a child. Grief is seldom discussed openly in our culture, and the death of a child makes people feel even more uncomfortable. We approach the topic openly and honestly, speaking to people who have lost loved ones and experts who help care for them. Whether you are a parent experiencing loss or someone who wants to support another going through this tragedy, this podcast strives to offer hope and help.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for agreeing to come on the Always Andy's podcast today. I'm really looking forward to talking.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. I think it was exciting for me when I saw what you're doing, and I think it's really helpful. I remember, when my daughter first died, and I don't remember seeing anything out there in terms of connecting with other people that might have helped me to navigate the process. So, some years later now, 6 years later, when I saw that you were doing this, I thought, gosh, I got to talk to this gal.
Oh, well, I am so glad you reached out. And I'm really excited to talk to you too, because what you're doing is something I'm completely and totally unfamiliar with. And so I know nothing. So I always love being able to learn new things. So I think you're going to be able to teach me a lot today. And that's kind of fun.
Oh, well, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess I could start out by sharing that I did lose my daughter, Madrona. So I have four daughters, and Madrona was the second born. And, so this has been 6 years ago. She was 13 when she passed. And when I think about, the context of Madrona in my life, I think about rising up to meet a challenge. She was shortly after being born, Madrona stopped breathing. When she was born, everything went great with the pregnancy. She was really healthy. Her APGAR score was really good. And we were sort of having a party a couple hours later, eating ice cream and celebrating her arrival. Yeah, just normal stuff. And, she was nursing and that had gone well. And apparently at some point during the nursing process, 2 hours later, which is really uncommon, she had stopped breathing. And so she ended up with a hypoxic event, lack of oxygen to the brain. And we're not sure for how many minutes, but by the time everybody had mustered to revive her, some damage had been done.
Yeah.
So so
What a
we began a
scary
whole
thing to
journey.
happen, because you feel like at that point you are pretty safe, right? I mean, you feel like,
Everybody's let down their guard. Yeah,
I know, I know.
yeah,
I certainly
yeah,
think that. I mean, I see newborns all the time and I just
yeah,
don't get worried about them after those first few minutes, honestly. We do those APGARs, and
yeah,
if you're good, you're
yeah.
kind of good. And we obviously look for some things, but we don't expect them to just stop breathing. Hmm.
Yeah, and that was the opinion of everybody who we've ever told, and the people who were present at that time. It's like you do let your guard down after it's something like in the first 15 minutes where 95% of problems occur, right?
Right.
So after 2 hours, we're going on with our lives, and so we kind of got thrust into the middle of what is the beautiful and terrifying world of emergency medicine. And and that tender space of a newborn, and watching your daughter, watching for me Madrona being poked and prodded and handled roughly in order to save her life, but also knowing somewhere intuitively that those the way she's handled at those moments affect everything about her development. I would later learn about trauma to the mouth and throat and how that affects the development of eating and talking. Because I spent a long time sort of studying that, since Madrona would never in her life fully learn to talk. She would only be able to make sounds and became extremely expressive with her facial gestures, which she was amazing how much she could bring somebody in and communicate with them through those alone. But a couple months in Children's Hospital, and every test under the sun, nothing was ever found that would be a cause for her to stop breathing. Yeah, but so we soldiered on.
Where are you
Yeah.
located then?
So that was Seattle Children's Hospital, and
Okay.
at the time we were living north of Seattle, up kind of close to the Canadian border in a town called Bellingham.
Okay.
Yeah. So we were quickly flown down to Children's for the rest of that couple months, and by the time that Madrona headed home with us, they wouldn't let us leave without her being on phenobarbital, which I don't think anybody gives anymore. It's a pretty intense drug of the barbiturates.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was because they had seen some evidence for seizure activity.
Yeah.
And she also had a G tube, so she would eat through a tube into her stomach. And yeah, it was the beginning of quite a journey of those type of medical interventions, and also the beginning of a search and a commitment on my part to not accept the diagnosis fully, to see it more as a starting point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also to not feel disabled as a parent. If
Right.
disability is the topic we're in, disability is quite infectious. Even when you tell yourself you can't do something, pretty quickly you're right. You know.
Right. Right.
So
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, in
So
some ways, I think the labels can be a little bit harming, because you can let that limit you. I think depending on someone's personality too, you know?
yeah, yeah. So for us and for me in particular, like this idea of disability, I think back to how was I prepared to cope with a situation like that, and most of us aren't prepared at all. But I did have something in my upbringing that I realized later really kind of did give me some coping mechanisms. And so my dad had been a Green Beret in the Vietnam era, so Special Forces Army. And back then they didn't do a whole lot of post operative processing of any sort. There was no
Right.
debrief. And so then we ended up, of course, with this amazing amount of what we now know to be PTSD
Hmm.
in the veterans of that era. And as I thought about it, my dad has passed now, but as I thought back to the way he was in my childhood, I think that there was a lot of characteristics of that sort of repressed trauma that PTSD shows up as. And so one thing I think he did in his effort to offer love to me, it may not have looked like a lot of love at times, but was to make damn sure that I was strong. And because of that embattlement that he had been in the
Yeah.
war,
Hmm.
he knew the world was a scary and dangerous place. He didn't know what to do about it emotionally, but he knew that I needed to be strong for some reason. So this overcoming of challenges was from the beginning a part of my upbringing.
Hmm.
And so obviously the role modeling of dealing with your emotions, not so strong for me. Took a lot longer to start learning about that. But what I did with it is I went out and found challenges and overcame them. So I grew up at a little ski area in the mountains of Washington, and right away I'm skiing by the time I'm 2, and then I'm out ski racing within a couple years after that, and doing really well at that, and then mountain bike racing and rock climbing and mountaineering, and it just anything I could think of to conquer as a challenge. That was sort of what I was prepared to do through
Hmm.
the home environment I had.
That's funny.
So
You and I are a little bit similar that way because
yeah,
you were talking about, people saying you can't do something, pretty soon you can. And I thought, oh, that's the opposite of me. If someone tells me I
yeah,
can't do something, I am bound to
yeah,
determine going to be able to do it. Like I,
yes,
I, that's a big thing. I hate if somebody
yeah,
tells me I can't do something because I'm going to do it. And that seems like you a little bit. Like
that's
if
true.
there's a challenge and you can't do it, oh, yes, I can.
That's absolutely true. And kind of what I was pointing towards is when we tell ourselves we can't do
Oh, I know.
something.
I know what you
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
meant.
yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and
Yeah, I know
I'm
that's what you
I'm the
meant, but
same
I
as
was
you.
thinking to
Yeah,
myself, yep.
yeah,
But when other people
yeah,
tell me that, no,
yeah,
no.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. I'm the same way. Yeah, it's yeah,
But that
challenge,
served you well as a parent of a kid with challenges, right?
Yes, yes, it really
Uh huh.
did. And I think also to well, I'll tell a quick story because I refused to see her as disabled. I mean, I wasn't blind to the fact that I was feeding her and had to take her to the bathroom and then, stroll her around in a wheelchair. It's not like I was living with my head in the clouds, but I refused to see it as a static experience. What started to happen for me is I began to see the universality of disability, that we're all on this spectrum of disabling ourselves from our capacity in life. So, all you have to do is raise the bar, and now somebody sucks at something. If you're hanging out with Olympic athletes,
Right.
like,
Right.
like maybe you're a little disabled.
Right. I'm really disabled.
Yeah, right. And so because I had that athletic background and sort of achievement mindedness, I saw her as just whatever the next hurdle was. I looked through the lens of getting in my empathic ability to see through her eyes what she's up against, and helping her, psychologically to get in the right mindset. And then we would tackle whatever it was, whether she would become afraid or intimidated or insecure or beat herself up, whatever the thing was that kept her from engaging with the challenge. And if the challenge was physically not possible, I would sort of sneakily remove that hurdle so that she still had the experience that she did it. An example of that would be like, so she had 3 sisters at the time, and because of the outdoorsy sort of leanings that I have, I was always taking them out to experience adventures, in the mountains or skiing or climbing or whatever we were doing. And I remember we took a day out on this lake, and we found this great big old growth stump that was at the edge of the lake, and somebody had cut steps into it. I think it was probably 10 feet in the air. And at the top, they put this huge log plank that extended out maybe 10 feet further into the lake, where it was deep enough where you could dive. And so I'm looking at it, a couple of my kids are pretty small, but that never really held us back before. So I was going up there, and I'd keep them safe because, you're pretty high up, and I was throwing my littlest one off, and they were giggling and loving it. And Madrona's sitting in her wheelchair watching this, and I recognized something in her eyes. It's kind of like a little devilish look, like she was thinking, oh, I wonder if I'd like to do that. And as soon as I caught her eyes, she immediately looked away. Like, she knew that I saw her, and she knew that if she wanted to do something, all she'd have to do is give me the slightest go ahead, and then she'd be doing it within a minute. And so she didn't want to look at me, and she started kind of squealing and like in terror of what might happen next. So I went over and talked to her. And I'm like, what do you think, Madrona? Do you want to go up there? Are you excited? You like seeing what your sisters are doing? And she couldn't talk for maybe a full minute. She was just kind of like squeezing every muscle. And then she finally looked at me, and I said, you ready? And she nodded. So I threw over my shoulder, and we climbed up the stump, and then off we go together. I didn't just throw her like she couldn't swim by herself. So we went under the water, of course, as you would when you fall 10 feet. And up we come, and she's sputtering a little bit, and we swim to shore. She's laughing the whole way. So that's kind of my approach to disability. It's like, yeah, she couldn't climb up there herself, but she still got the same experience as her sister.
Sure she did. She did. That's awesome.
So that's just sort of like, there was a lot of that over the years with her. It was a real joy.
So what happened then when she was older?
So she continued to progress at a pace that would maybe, make paint drying seem fun, but I always saw the progress, and I would celebrate that with her. And as long as there was progress, I just knew that could be sustained forever.
Right.
But as going back to this time, I think about, leaving. Well, I was in the hospital, having these arguments with like the preeminent neurologists. Here I am, only 25 years old or whatever at the time, having these arguments with these extremely bright, gifted, successful neurologists. But they're telling me, not to expect much, that really there's not much hope for Madrona. And I'm looking at it, and I'm feeling into my heart and my intuition. And I'm thinking, no way, that's not right. I don't think you're looking at this right. But of course, I've got to craft the language. I've got to use the language of somebody in that esteem, who sort of protects themselves with a language of secrecy, that nobody understands except for them. And it's almost impenetrable, but I had to think quick on my feet. And I'm like, wait a second, are you telling me that you don't believe in neuroplasticity? And it's no, there's like, at this time, this is before the science has sort of come around to see that neuroplasticity is, you know, it's evidence, it's evidence-based. And it was like, no, there's no evidence for that. I'm like thinking, oh, there's got to be evidence for that because I've experienced it myself, you know, like it's just, it's a thing. And so, you know, having those kind of arguments, but also listening to my intuition because I'm not a trained doctor. I'm way out of my league. I have to respect, you know, that I've got to lean on their intelligence, their experience to navigate this world. But I've got to listen to my heart at the same time because sometimes they're falling back on stuff that's a little antiquated and outdated because that's the way they learned it 30 years previous to when they're trying to apply it. So that process of navigating that, and I think too, you know, just knowing that the phenobarbital wasn't helpful. I I came home and when Madrona was under the influence of the phenobarbital, it was amazing because we could sleep. And when she wasn't under the influence of the phenobarbital, she was screaming at the top of her lungs 24/7. So we had this sort of like, I felt kind of dirty that I loved the phenobarbital giving us sleep, but I knew that she was so checked out, so loopy, so not here with us that I couldn't really, I couldn't feel like we were going in a good direction or that it would lead us where we wanted to go. So then that's when sort of my intuition mixed with my spirituality. I started to kind of tap into some of these experiences that maybe we'll get into, where I had been doing sweat lodges since the age of 13 and exploring Native American spirituality. And it had helped me to develop a relationship with sort of the workings of the universe that aren't as obvious to the scientist. It's sort of the felt experience, the workings of the heart. You know, when somebody is heartbroken, what is that? It's
Mm-hmm.
not. It can turn into heart disease for certain, but it's something that's not quite yet physical, but can manifest in many physical ways. So I called a old friend who was the Buffalo chief of the Lakota Nation. He was a healer, and I asked him to come and visit with me and help Madrona. This is when she was still just a couple years old, and we really needed to, or maybe it was about a year old. I'm trying to remember now. I just knew I needed to get her back with us to where she wasn't screaming if she was
Yeah.
unaltered and knocked out if she was altered. That was no life. And so he came and he did a ceremony, which a ceremony for them in this particular type of ceremony is basically praying to the creator for an intervention. And they do drumming and singing and you can see all kinds of wild things happening around you in this space. And after the ceremony and the prayers for Madrona, he said that he really thought that the phenobarbital would prevent her from developing normally, and that somehow I've got to figure out a way to get her off of that. And that wasn't an easy task, but I did take it on. And he also pointed me towards a medicine that grew in the mountains where I lived at the time, and said that that would help give her the strength that she needed. And I think he was thinking about the seizures, but I'm not sure. So we did those two things, and I would say it took about 2 months. It was a battle to get the neurologist to actually let us take her off of it, and we actually did have to get an EEG that was showing that she didn't have current seizure activity.
Mm-hmm.
But we passed those hurdles and finally got through that. And for the first time, she stopped screaming and she was present. And then I played this little game with her, like I've been doing the whole time, to try to engage with her. And she started laughing, this most
Oh,
hilarious laugh. It was just the most gorgeous thing I'd ever heard. And
I'm sure.
everybody in the room just stopped and started crying and giggling with her. So yeah, this sort of the intuition, the spirituality, the rising to challenges, those are the themes that seem to keep me with my head above water
Mm-hmm.
during something that I would look around in some of the places where we were, and I could see that some people were drowning in that type
Yeah.
of challenge. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly tough. I mean, you have to be an advocate for your child for sure. And it's it's not easy. It's not easy being in medicine either with families, because too, I think from that perspective, it's hard for us to see what goes on at home, right? Because we
Yes,
get these little snippets of time when we see kids in the office, and we don't really know how they are at home and what
that's
life's
right.
like every day. And so it's a challenge. I'm glad you were able to kind of defend yourself, I think, enough to
Yeah,
get really listened to, because I think some
yeah.
doctors are better at listening than others.
Yeah, that bedside manner thing, it's certainly not gone, but it's just absolutely beautiful when a doctor still really values it. I think it's something we
Mhm.
shouldn't get rid of from the previous generation, that that does so much of the healing. It's just like sometimes somebody just needs to know that, somebody's got their back and that
Mhm.
they're listening, and for some reason I don't know that concept ever really got to neurology for some reason. And I'm grateful to the wonderful neurologists out there. Please don't hear me giving you a hard time. But
Uh,
I have a lot of empathy for you guys and the work that you do. Without a doubt, it's got to be so challenging. And I know, the long-term caregiver in particular is such a difficult and interesting position to be in. And
yes.
it's just a miracle if you can hang on to your humanity for extended periods of time of that depth of challenge.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah. So
So as she got older, how did things kind of develop then? You said she just developed very slowly, but she did make
yeah,
progress.
she did make progress. We initially we were homeschooling her, and it just sort of seemed to make sense because we were so involved with physical therapies and various therapies that we had learned about, and diet. It's like it was a full day just to get everything done, and then we're like, okay, we've got these other kids. And so let's wrap them into it. They can participate, and we'll make it so, if we're teaching one, the other's learning. So it just seemed like an efficiency thing to homeschool for a while, and then as we made enough progress where Madrona was really able to participate in life, and it didn't feel so medical anymore.
Hmm.
We progressed, like one progression would be from G tube to NG tube, which is the one that goes through your nose, to bottle feeding of soft foods, to chewing. So that's
Ah.
that encompasses a massive amount of work for somebody who lacks the brain and motor control connection to do that.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
but that progress also allows for then a caregiver who's not specifically trained, such as a nanny, to be part of our lives so that we can get back to work. So that all led itself to her being able to be in school and to be with a paraeducator. And
Yeah.
circling back to that bright, like if you can see this beautiful blonde haired, bright blue eyed girl with such an engaging smile in this wheelchair, stuck in this world. But she somehow, with her face and her energy, she would
Yeah.
just suck you in to what she wanted you to communicate with her on, like, without using words. And I would always turn around and find her in this deep conversation with somebody that I just met. I'm like, wow, there she goes again. She's doing it. So we just realized she needed to get out in the world and continue this
Mhm.
work that she was doing with people. We didn't understand it, but we could see its effects.
Well,
So,
and she, I'm sure, loved it. I'm sure she
oh, she
loved
loved
going.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, she did.
Uh-huh.
She
Yeah.
did.
I've got
Yeah.
many patients that I can think of that are similar. I've got a blonde curls, blue-eyed one that I'm thinking of right now that sounds very much like her. So, and her
Yeah.
parents are very much like you too, and that
Yeah.
they never really, they just like, they're gonna go for a walk. Let's just throw her in the wagon. They just would put her in
Yeah.
the wagon and they just all
Yeah.
go. And it
Yeah.
never seemed to hold them back, which I always found so amazing. Right. It's just
Yeah.
I love families like that. I mean, if you can, right? If you're
Yeah.
like, well, she just goes in the wagon. She just does it
Yeah.
in a different way than everybody else, but
Yeah.
she still seemed to always get the same experiences as everybody else, which I
Yes.
think is beautiful.
Yeah, and obviously, the mainstream culture, that sort of mainstreaming idea where we're trying to, get kids back into the classroom instead of the special ed room and
Mm-hmm.
warehousing and all that. There's definitely been some, society-wide improvement in that way. But then what you're describing is really taking it up another level where, yeah, the kid is aware that they're different, but so are some of the other kids. There's,
Mm-hmm.
kids with, they're on the spectrum, they've got Asperger's, each of these kids, we're become so aware that each of these kids, oh, that one's got the peanut allergy and I'm just the one who can't talk. It's like they can kind of see how, as long as their parents are bringing them through all the experiences, that maybe they can get over the differences a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I
Yeah, and
love
I
seeing
think you're
that
right.
too.
It helps the other kids when they
Yeah,
see that, like other
yeah,
kids that might be considered more, more neurotypical, normal kind
yeah,
of kids. If they
yeah.
see these different things, I think they'll end up being more accepting.
I
Hmm.
agree. And yeah, that's back to that idea of the universality of disability. It's if we're all trying to look the same and think the same and act the same, it does give us a sense of peace because the world's predictable, but that's not really the world. It's not
It's
actually how we
boring.
feel. Yeah, and that's not even how we feel. It's kind of
No.
bogus,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's sort of in the color and the variety of life. And as we embrace, that we don't need to scare each other if we think differently. It actually can complement. It can bring some some surprise and some joy to each other's lives if we understand how we're different and that it's okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I think that I learned a lot from Madrona in that regard because I remember meeting people and having the whole spectrum of reactions. Some
Yeah.
people you could see almost pain come in their face when they and Madrona's sitting there beaming her beautiful smile, and I'm like, that's what you're getting out of this, like you're,
Uh-huh.
but they just don't know what to do with all the emotion that
Mm-hmm.
comes up for them, and so, I love that idea of mainstreaming for that reason, because being around something for a little while, all of a sudden you get a chance to feel those things, or maybe it's fear, maybe it's judgment, maybe there's something that feels kind of yucky when you see somebody who's not perfect. It just really varies. But I had to look at it all. I had to look at all those faces as I was not going to let Madrona miss out on anything. So we were right there in the front seat, with everybody having to experience it. So
Yeah. I
yeah,
love it.
yeah.
So then you said she
So
passed away now 6 years ago.
yeah. So at the age of 13, that would have been just at the beginning of 2016. And yeah, so I was driving. So a few years before that, uh, my 4 daughters' mother and I divorced,
Mm-hmm.
and we had gotten to the point, and just there's so much growing that happens when you deal with a challenge like this. It's not a guarantee that you're going to grow in the same direction,
Mm-hmm.
and so you can grow apart too. So I was picking up my daughters from my ex's house, and on the December evening, it was already dark as the days are so short in the north, and we're driving down the interstate, and the my daughters, three of them are like loudly talking over each other and in an excited way. We've just gotten in the car together, and it's
Yeah.
and I'm kind of enjoying it, like you might enjoy the sound of a bunch of birds in the tree outside your door, all making a loud sound. And so it's kind of a pleasant sound to hear my daughters talking, and something hits me on the intuitive level, on the heart level. I could feel something, and I look up in the rearview mirror. Of course, the car is dark, so I turn the dome light on so I can see a little better. And Madrona is not paying attention to her sisters, which was very uncharacteristic of her.
Mm-hmm.
She would be right in the middle with every sentence, waiting for the response, look back, and is it, if there was something funny building, she would be anticipatory of the laughter that was to come, and all of that. She was just so with it that way, and so empathetic that way. And she was disengaged, and I said, "Hey, Madrona, what's going on?" And she didn't respond. And so immediately I pulled over. I'm on the interstate doing 70 miles an hour, but luckily there was an off ramp close by.
Mm-hmm.
So I get on the off ramp, decelerate, get over the shoulder, get out of the car, and I get one of my kids out of the way, moved across the seats, and she had a special car seat. So I quickly undo that and I pull her out of the car so I can evaluate what's going on with her. And I look at her and she's not breathing and she's starting to look a little blue. And so I throw her over my knee so I get her inverted and give her some good whacks on the back to see if we've got to dislodge something. And I flip her back over, no progress. So I do a mouth scoop and try to figure out if there's anything there. Nothing there at all. I can't see anything in there. And so I just begin CPR at this point and give a few quick rescue breaths. And then I tell my daughters, dial 911, grab my phone, oldest daughter, because so she would have been well able at that point. And so she's on the phone, and and I'm conveying in between breaths now where we are, what we need to my daughter and to Firecom. And so now I'm noticing that there's some blood around my daughter's mouth, and I'm thinking, what is this? Why is blood coming out of her lungs? And I'm too in the moment of being that first responder to really be in a place of thinking what's going on or diagnosing what's going on.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
You're not in diagnostic mode.
Yeah. No, I'm in save the life first. We'll talk later.
Survival.
Yeah. So I return to the rescue breaths, and now she's starting to seem more conscious to me. And so I pause, and now she's roughly breathing on her own. So I work on her position, because with her lack of muscle and motor control, airway positioning becomes an issue if you're upright and not supported in a chair and all that. So I'm kind of now creating this chair out of my body and waiting and monitoring and seeing if I have to return to resuscitation. And the people show up and all that. And we're off then on this grand journey again, where we go to the local hospital and they decide to intubate. She didn't need to be intubated, but they wouldn't fly her to Children's without intubating her. Okay. So then I didn't want to intubate her because of my awareness that that can be a one-way trip when you intubate. And so she was saturating fine in terms of her oxygen with CPAP, which is an assisted air breathing system. And but they wouldn't fly her, and she needed to go because they really didn't have the staffing to address the rest of her workup. So off we go to Children's, and within a couple weeks, within a couple days, but we had figured out it was the pulmonary embolism, and that was the source of the blood. And that we could look at that in terms of how that came about is too much time sitting in the wheelchair, but it's something it's a dance, because the wheelchair enables her to engage with life, which is so important to the psychological health. And then getting her out of the chair and doing the physical therapy is, of course, what keeps her healthy. So that dance is hard to figure out. Yeah. And so we spent a couple weeks in the hospital and got back out because, she was now with oxygen assist, and we thought, okay, and we got it to a place where maybe she'll turn the corner. And she was only out for a couple days, and we went back to Children's for what would be the last time. And so she passed away there. Yeah. She was surrounded by me and her sisters and her mother and a caregiver, a nanny that we had, and it was obviously one of the most difficult things you can imagine, and I'm just glad we could be there for her.
Yeah, that is nice to be able to be right there and surrounding them, I think, during those kind of moments. But it's just so difficult.
So we talk about challenges and me overcoming challenges. I had now a challenge that might widely be thought of as one of the most difficult challenges to face, which is the loss of your child. And it's just something you don't know what to do about. You don't know how to even feel. It's too huge.
It's right. You can't even wrap your head around it, right? And I know that she had challenges for a long time, so you probably thought in your mind, certainly I may outlive her, right? I'm sure
Yeah.
those thoughts went through your head, but
Yeah.
until you actually live it, you really didn't have a clue.
No,
Wow.
no. Yeah. And it's, that's sort of like positive thinking versus actually taking the action. Like
Right.
you can only get so far with thinking you're a great skier. At some point you're going to have to put on some skis and see how it goes, kind of thing. So when you go through the process of preparing yourself to face great challenges, there's just nothing that can prepare you for the loss of a child,
Mm-mm.
you know?
As much as you might want to. I think of my
Yeah.
friend Stephanie often when I talk to people like you, because she said she saw a counselor to kind of prepare her for her daughter's death. She sort of, in a way, thought she was ready, kind of, with
Yeah.
as much time as they spent thinking about it and knowing this was inevitably going to happen. But yeah, it happened, and suddenly, nope, you just want her back. You just want a few more minutes. You just want, and
Yeah.
you really just didn't have a clue. Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm so glad you put together this podcast because I'm guessing it was probably helpful for you too to kind of create a
Oh, for sure.
space. Yeah, yeah, to talk about it. I didn't want to talk about it obviously for a little while, and I think it took you maybe a year before you did your
Yeah, yeah, it
podcast.
was about a
Yeah,
year before I did the
yeah. Well,
podcast.
for me it's 6 years, so
So why
no,
don't you
I
talk about your grief journey and talk about the things that have been helpful to you and kind of what this has all morphed into?
okay. Yeah, so. Yeah, so the grief journey. So I remember when I was not too long after the passing of my daughter. I think you go through, for me at least, and I think probably most of us go through that shock. And for me, I think of that as numb.
Mhm.
Uh, you can almost look at the experience without feeling. You just kind of look over the details of it. You run through the the chronological experience, and you're
Mhm.
like, you're kind of having to convince yourself that it's real because it doesn't
Yeah,
feel real.
right.
Yeah, and so once I'd done
100%.
that, yeah, I've done that a fair bit. It didn't seem clear to me like how to move forward, how to engage with life. I wasn't sure what life was
Mhm.
from that state of raw numbness. And so one thing I found that helped me is I remember sitting and thinking about the things that would bring me joy. So like getting outside and taking a walk in a beautiful place would normally help me feel peaceful, help me feel grounded, even inspire me, to maybe do some writing or just release some stress. I would think about the fact that I used to have that experience, and
Mhm.
I would just kind of shake my head and go, huh, nah.
Yep.
And so one thing I started to do was to ignore that part of me that felt like I needed to be motivated to do it or have to decide to do it. So I would decide that whatever the weather and whatever my resistance or whatever my thinking or lack of desire was, I would just get outside and I would, grab a journal and I'd walk to a beautiful spot. Didn't feel beautiful at the moment, and I would just sit there and I would remind myself by looking around, oh, that is a beautiful river. Just the
Mhm.
words. It wasn't, I had no feeling right then, but I'm like, yeah, that's that beautiful white river right there. And then look up at the trees and like, gosh, those are big, tall, beautiful trees. And so that was sort of like a talking me down from that ledge that I found myself of numbness back to the earth, back to this moment. And then I would think about, of course, those thoughts of grief and waves of numbness and pain would come back to fight with
Yeah.
this perception of the beauty of the moment. And so what I found out about myself was that I was really lacking in self-love, um, where I had spent all these years in service and teaching and leading and working and providing for my family. I had done that out of a love for others.
Mhm.
And what I hadn't really spent nearly enough time doing is really listening to my needs and loving myself. Building up that habit, that muscle, that reflexive response when I am feeling a need that I can acknowledge it and take care of it. And so that came to bite me a little bit in this moment of heartbreak and grief, is I didn't have the muscle memory of how to love myself.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing I would do is I would go through the story of the life of Madrona, and I would remember from the perspective of sort of watching all the things I did to contribute to her development, to help her experience joy and life and freedom. And then this weird, peculiar feeling would start to rise up, like an appreciation for me, a love of me. And rather than my love is my service, but rather appreciating like a third person would, oh, that's great what you did there.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found that doing that for a while was the closest I could get to outside of numbness and in self-love.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like a celebration of life that I found to be useful. And yeah, and I think you're kind of hinting at something, and where all this came from, and to that as well, is I had spent some many years pursuing the Native American spiritual path, and that started when I was 13, and felt drawn to it. I had this immense connection to nature,
Mm-hmm.
and living in the mountains in a wilderness. I spent a lot of time wandering and hiking, and just really kind of in that meditative state where I felt so much connection to it. But then I'd read these stories of the Native Americans, and they were having conversations with deer and bear and buffalo. The buffalo would come to them with a message and explain, how to live their lives, or to find their dreams and manifest their dreams. And I thought, well, that's a whole nother level. I want something like that in my life. And so that's what, at the age of 13, what I thought of is I've got to get some more experience. And how do they do that? It's not, there's something there. There's a spirituality. There's a belief that all of God's creatures can communicate. That's part of their culture. So I started pursuing that, and that led me into doing the sweat lodges. And so and I've done at this point, something like a 1,000 or more than 1,000 sweat lodges, because it's where I began to feel this spirituality finally embodied in me, this connection to nature, this connection to God. And that's when you ask what helped me to get out of it. I felt so disconnected to it for a little while there. I think I kind of lost that connection, lost my faith, lost that trust, that trust. And, here I'd been doing good and serving and loving and trusting and living in faith all these years. And then, everything was swept out from underneath me. And I thought, oh, okay, well, what good was that for? That sort of cynical view that you can find yourself in those dark places, which I spent a little while in a very dark place.
I totally understand that. I feel like that is my biggest challenge right now still is trust. Trust.
Yes.
And because when something like this happens, especially with me, when it was super sudden, it's just like your safe world is suddenly not. And you just lose that ability to trust that things are going to be okay, because, my life was going pretty okay. I mean, not that I hadn't had a lot of different tragedies, because certainly I had, but to suddenly just be talking to your son one minute about reading Lord of the Rings, and 2 seconds later he's dead. That's immense loss of trust that the world is a safe place, right?
Gosh, no kidding. No kidding. That when you talk about like the trust and when it leaves, I think about the metaphor of your body after an injury. When you get hurt, like for me, I broke my leg skiing a couple years back, and there's the healing process. There's they fix it with pins and screws, and so we begin. But part of what happens is extremely painful for a very long time, and so long that you just have to kind of come to terms with this pain as part of my life. Then finally to get back into life and to start, putting weight on your leg, trusting that it can support you, and not being afraid that it's going to break again. And there's this whole period of process where you're guarding, you're protecting yourself from what no longer feels like something you can rely upon. You no longer trust. So I think about psychological guarding in that way.
Yeah.
Is that it's important but so dangerous. It's like hanging on to the crutches long after your leg is healed,
Mhm.
right? And but they're invisible, so you can have them and nobody knows you have them. It's only you that knows you cut yourself off from life and trust and love and faith, and you can kind of keep that secret because you don't have the crutches visible.
Yeah.
So
I love that
yeah,
analogy. I
yeah,
think of little kids. So sometimes I see little kids and the parents will say, well, he or she isn't walking, but I know they can, but they just
yeah,
don't. And
yeah,
so what I will have them do is I'll have them take a spoon and they hold on to one end of the spoon and the kid holds on to the other end of the spoon and they walk along because they'll
yeah,
walk holding hands, right? But so now
yeah.
you're going to walk along holding a spoon. And when they're not looking, you let go.
This is
And they
good.
will often keep walking
Yeah,
until they suddenly realize you're not there anymore. And then it was this realization
yeah,
of,
yeah,
oh, I just did that by myself, but they
yeah.
didn't know it. So it reminded me very much of that when you gave that
Mm,
analogy. So it's like getting that
yeah,
trust is
yeah.
hard to do. And sometimes you have to sneakily do it in a
Well,
way.
and I also like the analogy of the body because anytime, in our lives from childhood on that we experience something that's too big for us to really wrap our minds around,
Mm-hmm.
if it's in your childhood, you can't understand it. You just need to be safe. What we'll typically do is hide that experience in our body for a time later when we're able to face it and deal
Mm-hmm.
with it. So people can end up with, like for me, I've dealt with at times back strain or, like they say, pain in the neck. So I've carried things in my body because I
Mm-hmm.
needed to get through an experience, but it'll be waiting for me later in my body. So I like the idea of really digging into guarding because we put it in our body, but then we have to guard it because we're still not ready to face what that pain contains.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that somatic way of seeing sort of the flip side of the coin is one thing is maybe the actual experience, and the other is the psychological impact. And if we can keep flipping that coin back and forth through feeling it in our body, then in time, the coin doesn't matter which side it's on. If you're feeling your body or you're having the thought, it doesn't just jump to the other side and hide itself from you.
Wow.
Oh,
I like that.
yeah,
I hold
yeah,
mine all right here in my neck.
yeah.
I hold it
It's a good
all right
spot.
there.
It's a good spot.
You're
You
going to
can't
teach me
see
how
it.
to let go of it? Is that what you're going to do now?
Yes, that's okay. Close your eyes. Yeah,
Oh.
that's where the coaching comes in.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
talk about what you're doing now.
Mhm. So, so all these experiences, my sort of unique upbringing, coupled with the areas of life that drew me in or I found myself in. So whether that's
Mm-hmm.
the Native American spirituality to end up with a more rich connection with nature and a cosmology, a view of the universe that enabled me to feel like I knew where I was in the universe. So going through these different stages, and then of course what we talked about with Madrona, both the
Mm-hmm.
challenge that she brought into my life, the gifts, and then learning to thrive in that situation, and then of course the rug being swept out. So I'd done all this work, all this sort of development of myself over so many years, and then the rug was ripped out from underneath me, so
Mm-hmm.
that then I could truly begin again with there's a part of us that everything works unless it's really, really hard, and then it doesn't work. And I found that to be true for me. So now I had to create a new basis, a new foundation for myself, for my life that was not lacking in self love this time. I prioritize that very high now because I know that if you're in a dark place, if you're lacking trust and you can't even trust yourself, you can't feel safe in your own self, you lack that self-love, that darkness, that pit is kind of bottomless.
Yeah.
And you get down there a little ways, and if you're not even looking up for the light, you can spend way too long there. And of
Wow.
course, a plant or anything alive without light for too long withers. And so I went down that whole path. So I think that this where I'm at now, what I'm doing now is the synthesis of that journey.
Mm-hmm.
Is kind of like you did. Obviously, you've spent already many years helping people in medicine, but perhaps it's a different branch of medicine that you're practicing now.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You know,
I talk about that quite a bit too, in that I had to really redefine myself too and think about who am I really? Because I think you have to do that when you feel like everything is different and you're not the same person you were. And I found at my core that I am a caregiver and I care for people. And how can I help care for people in my grief? Well, I can help them through this podcast, through things like this,
yeah,
trying to get people connected, allowing people to share their stories of their children, just bringing a little hope and healing to grieving families. So that's how I could continue to be me and have my grief be a part of it. And so I think that
yeah,
sounds so much like you, and that you started over and had to really define yourself as
mhm,
to who you are now.
yeah, yeah. You can't skip a step there. It's like it'd be nice if I could just go through the pain and grief, and then get back to where I was. But there
No,
there is no where you were anymore. That
nope.
blew up.
Mhm,
Yeah,
mhm.
the new you includes that you're now part of a family of people whose hearts have been broken wide open, and we work together. We relate to
Mhm.
each other. Yeah, we understand each other. So yeah, so I think about that grief, that numbness, and but then there's something also that occurred for me after the loss of my daughter, where I was so shocked and so without an understanding of how to respond that I was looking around and seeing things really clearly. I could look at a tree and see just the most beautiful, intricate thing I'd ever seen and just stare at it in appreciation and awe. I was like, wow, this is a nice side effect of your whole life going down the tubes. So but that's something that we can really capitalize on and make use of it, because it is healing to see without all of our thoughts, without all of our prejudgments and filters that we get through life with. A break from that can be really transcendent. It can bring us back to the divine. And when I used that sort of same awareness and openness that I felt was so beautiful, and I looked at other people, I could see right into that loss, that grief that we all experience. So
Uh-huh.
then that was the beginnings of a new chapter of where my work is calling me. Is
Mhm.
like, oh, I think I would have been overwhelmed, intimidated, maybe a little afraid to be in the presence of somebody in the most desperate pain and grief that I couldn't understand. But
Right.
now I'm there with you, and so I can just be here. And do you ever notice? I'm sure you and maybe many of your listeners notice too, that you start to kind of feel into how much to share with somebody, because if they haven't
Mhm.
experienced that depth of loss, you're like, I'll just kind of, with kid gloves, bring you into a little bit of this experience, and then we're good. We'll come back out. It's good. But if somebody has gone there, there's something that opens up, and you're both like, hey, let's go. You want to go? Let's do it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a neat thing, because we all actually are going to be exposed to that level of grief at some point, and some of us are somehow
Mhm.
miraculously really good at hiding from it, or it doesn't show up until much later.
Mhm.
But so getting down and into this inner work related to grief and losses, I'm so glad that or a little bit earlier in my life, in my 30s, I got to start that journey, and now I can be as a coach, and I lead different opportunities for people to process that. I can hold that energy of it being okay to be vulnerable, to be present, and to allow the energy to start to move together with each other.
Mhm. And you have a podcast now.
I do. It's kind of just getting going. Nowhere like you years into it with all your podcasts, but I'm excited. Yeah, I'm excited. We were talking a little bit about my sweat lodge experience or Native American spirituality. So I have one on that you can, you guys
I've
can
listened
look
to that
out.
one.
Yeah.
It's great. I
Yeah.
learned a ton.
Yeah, that's mainly what I wanted to do in that one. Perhaps I'll do some follow-ups for going deeper, but a lot of people are vaguely aware of even what a sweat lodge is. So I thought I'd start with sort of the introductory, like here's what it is, here's how it works, and here's what it can do. So that's a good one if that's where you're at. And if you have experiences with sweat lodges and you want to go deeper in that conversation, hit me up and maybe that'll inspire me to pop another episode up about some of the depth that you can get to after thousands of them.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And
So
I think
got
I'm
the
going to be
podcast.
on at some point here too.
Yeah, I can't wait to get you on. I think we talked about perhaps in the next month, if your schedule and my schedule line up, I'd love to
It'll
have
be
you
perfect. It'll be great.
Yeah, I had to actually resist the temptation to ask you questions this whole time. So it'll be fun to
See, you had to hold back. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
All right.
So
well, thank you so much. How
Yeah.
can people hear from you, and what's the name of your podcast? Just to
So if you want to find me, I'm on Instagram and my website is the Ryan Hartford. So you'll find me either on Instagram as the Ryan Hartford or at my website, theryanhartford.com. And so, yeah, you can find out about my coaching or other offerings in those places. And there's also a link on my website to what are, I think, just a handful of podcasts now, but they'll be coming out in rapid succession here soon. So you guys can look forward to hearing more. And yeah, I just want to thank you for taking the time. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I look forward to learning more about you and your story on our podcast coming up.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, Ryan.
Okay, you take care.
Thanks for listening to Losing a Child, Always Andy's Mom. Please subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player. We are always looking for new show ideas. If you'd like to be a guest, know someone who'd be a great guest, or have a show idea, please email us at marcy@andysmom.com. Be sure to visit the webpage, andysmom.com, for more content, including Marcy's blog. There you can also sign up to receive updates via email. Together, let's work to inspire hope, one day at a time.